Good afternoon. Welcome to Asia Society. Good to see all of you in person in Asia Society at Park Avenue, and so many online in this hybrid event. We are here to celebrate President of Asia Society, Kevin Rudd's newest book, The Avoidable War. Now, Asia Society is very fortunate to have Kevin as president at this time, and also president of the Asia Society Policy Institute. He brings to the position and to his analysis and writing a formidable intellect and a practitioner's experience as the 43rd Prime Minister of Australia. I won't mention the foreign minister bit. To engage Kevin in a discussion on the book is Ian Bremmer, the president and founder of Eurasia Group. Ian is well known to all of us. He has been articulate, stimulating, and provocative on many international platforms, being interviewed or as interviewer. We look forward to a conversation between the two. I want to say sharpshooters, but I should be more respectful and say eminent persons. Now, let me say that the publication of this book could not have been more timely. War. Who would have guessed that a serious war would have broken out in Europe with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with the possibility of turning into World War III? A black swan, though some would say it is a gray one. In the last 2 years, we have fully focused on Asia because of the increasingly contentious relationship between the United States and China. It is a contest between the status quo power and the rising power. Are we walking into a Thucydides trap? Nobody wants war, such a cliche, but wars happen. I am certain neither the United States nor China want to go to war with each other, but we may be moving towards it unwittingly. Trade war, investment war, technology war, values war, and before we know it, a rail war. Recently, the possibility is more real. It sharpened during the Trump administration and continues through the Biden administration and the ascendance of Xi Jinping as president of China. It is about the contest for dominance in a comprehensive way. Now, in the region, we have seen Chinese military power grow. The United States has been supplying more arms and equipment to allies in Asia and countries in the region who seek to build up their forces of balance. The Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, of which I am the chairman, does an annual survey on the state of Southeast Asia, which showed that 76% of Southeast Asia recognize the country with the most influential presence in the region, influential economic presence in the region is China. At 76%. The United States is a distant second at 9.8% economic presence. And in terms of political strategic presence, China, 54% thought China was the more influential. 30% thought the United States was influential as a strategic political presence. But while welcoming the engagement with China, these countries are worried about this presence. Now, there are a couple of hotspots where the U.S. and China forces face each other directly: South China Sea, East China Sea, and Taiwan. Of the three, Taiwan is the most worrisome. And there has been loose speculation that the war in the Ukraine will push China to act on Taiwan. Now, I, for one, do not believe that. I'm sure there'll be discussion on this. But we do need to think through how to avoid war between the United States and China. So now I hand the floor over to Kevin and Ian. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heng Chee. It's wonderful to be back at the Asia Society here in New York. So to see so many of our friends and trustees who I've only seen in 2 dimensions for the last 2 years. So thank you to each and every one of you for being here. I really do appreciate it. And also to our guests here from across the political community and the publishing community. I also have Clive Priddle and Jamie Leifer from Public Affairs. Where are you? Thank you. From our publishers, thank you so much for your endurance, your patience, and your care for the production of this book. And my literary agent, Michael Carlisle, wave Michael, for putting up with me for the last period of time as well. As any of you who have tried to write a book know, it's like the birth of the elephant. It's long and it's painful, and eventually something pops out. And that's what this one has been like. So to those who've been part of the production process, thank you very much. And to the various members of my staff who've assisted me in producing this book, thank you. I'd particularly like to mention Nathan Levine and Danny Lee and Chen Jing, who have been of enormous assistance in the long process of putting this tome together. I'm only going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then Ian and I are going to have a conversation. We launched this book formally yesterday in Washington, in the Willard, with Senator Mitt Romney doing the honours. So it was good to be there amongst the Washington-based China analytical community, because those folks who follow this stuff carefully, that is, what China is up to and what's happening in the U.S. China relationship and how it's unfolding now with Russia and Ukraine, all exhibit a level of real anxiety about where this is headed. This is just not a normal set of events. It's an abnormal set of events. And you can construct scenarios which end in a very bad place indeed. But we'll come to that when we speak with Ian in a minute. 2 sets of remarks from me. One is, why a book like this, The Avoidable War? Well, in part, my friend and colleague from Harvard, Graham Allison, wrote a book called Destined for War, and that made me feel a little glum when I picked the cover up. And because I don't have a determinist view of history, and that I do believe in something called political agency, which is that political actors and leaders do have an impact through the choices they make and the leadership they exercise, it set my mind to thinking about, well, how could you construct a framework for the management of this relationship between Washington and Beijing, which isn't destined for war, but manages strategic competition in a way that makes sense in a national interest point of view in both capitals, and delivers a tetchy, tense, difficult relationship over time, highly competitive, sharp, contested, but without blowing each other's brains out, which I think is not a bad thing for everybody. When I started reading the broader literature on books such as this, and reflected on this extraordinary bloody century that we've been through, and that is the 20th century, 2 or 3 enduring lessons emerge for me. One is the lessons of 1914, long time ago, more than a century. But if you look at that war to end all wars, as it was described, World War I, and didn't end other wars at all. World War I was entirely avoidable. If you read the literature in 1914, frankly, most people thought it was impossible, very few thought it was probable, and no one at all wanted it. But when it got to 1 minute to midnight, neither prime ministers or monarchs or presidents, in the case of the French Republic, or the German Chancellor, or anybody else, or diplomats, were in a position to prevent it. And then you saw the unfolding dynamics of military mobilization. And once that happened, we had the guns of August. And then 60 million people lay dead. And the history of the world was changed, setting the seeds for the rise later of Nazi Germany. Second set of messages to emerge for me from the 20th century was the lessons of the 1930s, and that's not the failure of diplomacy, which is the problem of the First World War. The Second World War is the lesson of appeasement. And that is when you simply sat back as European governments and allowed Hitler to salami slice Europe bit by bit from 36 through to 39, you get to a point where, frankly, a general conflagration becomes impossible, but at a time when, in fact, it's much more difficult to handle militarily. That, I think, is the lesson, or the enduring lesson, for me, at least, of the Second World War. When I reflect back on the Cold War and the near-death experience we all went through in 1962 in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we did come within a hair's breadth of literally blowing each other's brains out back then, and seeking to discern what lessons emerge from it. It's a combined set of factors to do with the power of détente, the power of deterrence, and the power of diplomacy, underpinned by mutually assured destruction, deterrence, underpinned by what then began to unfreeze after the Cuban Missile Crisis, beginning in 1969 with the period of détente, and then into the 1970s where we had diplomacy. And so we managed to avoid a general conflagration. And in the end, through the application of a sustained United States strategy starting in 1948 with Kennan, a policy of containment over 40 years, successive US administrations, Republican and Democrat, remarkable given current politics. And so the Iron Curtain came down, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Eastern Europe was free. So for me, these sort of three sets of learnings, if you like, are very much alive in my mind in putting together something like this. Because the more I sit by and look as an observer, hopefully a semi-intelligent observer, of how the dynamics of this US-China relationship have changed over the last decade, I begin to see a pattern emerging. My Australian compatriot, a guy called Chris Clark, Professor of History at Cambridge University in the United Kingdom, a few years ago wrote this book called Sleepwalkers, How Europe Sleptwalked into the First World War. It's a very sobering read as to how avoidable that was and how diplomacy failed. The animating principle, therefore, behind this book is, I don't want us to sleepwalk into a war with China. This would be of catastrophic consequences for not just the two countries, China and the United States, but catastrophic for us all. Second set of remarks is, so what do you do about it, apart from pontificate, as I've just done? So you've got to get practical. So the whole idea of managed strategic competition is as follows. Right now, whatever may be said in the public domain to officially describe this US-China relationship, it is one of strategic competition, because the competitive race as to who does emerge as the dominant power militarily, economically and technologically in Asia and in the world. That's what's on. It's no longer just a regional race, by the way. Those of us who read carefully the Chinese literature, the Chinese documents, the Chinese ideological statements meant for their internal audience know that this is both a regional and now a global race. And so my simple Australian mind goes to this question. If you're going to have strategic competition, is it possible to have managed strategic competition or unmanaged strategic competition with no guardrails at all? The problem with unmanaged strategic competition is a bit like hopping on one of those roller coaster rides at Coney Island. It's great, it's exciting, but every now and then you face the risk of this thing just rolling right off the tracks and over the edge, and then you are into crisis, conflict and war, if there are no guardrails. The thing about the Cold War, at least post-62 and after the Cuban Missile Crisis, is both sides, the Soviet Union and China, then began to evolve rules of the road. And while there are some close moments between 62 and 91, when the Soviet Union eventually collapsed, there had emerged a series of protocols, a series of guardrails, particularly around the nuclear question, but others as well, which frankly militated against the entire relationship imploding into general war. So my argument is, rather than having unmanaged strategic competition, can we begin to evolve a mutually acceptable framework of managed strategic competition which has enough resonance in both Beijing and in Washington as to be credible? So final point, what's its architecture? 4 points. Again, not rocket science, just a bit of common sense. Number one, if you go to the essential strategic red lines in this U.S.-China relationship around the classical questions of Taiwan, the East China Sea, South China Sea, to some extent, depending on the future, the Sino-Indian border, but in particular cyber and space. Cyber warfare and, frankly, the capacity to blind people's ability to see what's going on through anti-satellite warfare. These constitute hard strategic red lines in the minds of each side. The question is, in defining them and, as it were, probing them, which is what militaries do, can you have a series of informal or semi-formal protocols between the highest levels of the militaries and the political command of both countries, which says, do not go there, or you will be in fundamentally dangerous territory? At present, that is inferred by one side in relation to the other. It is not known. And the problem with that is you can easily trip into a very dangerous and inflammatory situation. Principle number two is, if you can internally define what those strategic red lines may be, and there is not a large number of them, then you have guardrails, or should I say around them, which enable you in the rest of the relationship to have full-blown strategic competition. As you seek to develop your militaries, as you seek to expand your foreign policy influence in the region, grow your economies, expand your trade, accelerate your foreign direct investment and your portfolio investment and your position in global capital markets, and also more broadly engage in the great contest of technology and talent and which side and which system can attract the most, and a great contest for ideas about what should constitute the rules of the global order. Is it China's authoritarian state capitalist system, or should it be what we describe as the liberal international order continued to be anchored in American national power? And whether we like it or not, that ideological fight is already underway. Those of us who read the literature know it. So the second element of managed strategic competition, if you've got strategic guardrails against that first set of strategic red lines, and that is enough mutual knowledge to know don't go there, otherwise the ship could well blow up completely, then it enables you to therefore maintain a highly competitive relationship in these other domains. And my moral principle, to the extent to which I advocate one in this book, is simply may the best system win. Now, I have a fair bit of confidence as to what system I think could and should win, but may the best system win. And there's the third principle, which is on the way through, not out of goodness in my heart, not out of my sense of rolling kumbaya, or my sense of hand-holding in the corner, or the International League of Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. There will be core national interests in both Beijing and in Washington, which will mandate us, those two countries, cooperating in key defined areas. Climate, we've just had a session just now with former Vice President Al Gore, who I just introduced or concluded my remarks by saying he was the 45th president, not the Vice President of the United States. So pardon my antipody and error for that. Al forgave me at least for reminding him of what happened in 2000 and hanging Chads. But he gave us a great presentation on where the climate debate stands. It is not a feel-good moment. It is not an international socialist brotherhood moment. It is, we have an existential problem with climate change. It's happening. Therefore, what do we do about it? And guess what? If you don't act, it affects directly and fundamentally China's ability to grow food, China's ability to have clean air, China's ability to, in fact, sustain its population, as it does in this country as well. So managed strategic competition provides this third area of space for areas of defined continued strategic collaboration. Climate being one, the next pandemic, touch wood, perhaps hopefully being the next. Third, continued global financial stability, given the enormous debt burden which currently exists out there in global bond markets, which could implode at any point in the absence of effective high-level collaboration through the Financial Stability Board, the Basel Committee, and through the G20. To conclude, who's the policeman in this arrangement to make such a framework work bilaterally? Well, again, no rocket science here. It's, can you have a very simple but highly defined high-level group of American and Chinese administration officials. On the American side, a combination of the National Security Advisor, because they bring together all the threads of the US administration, maybe plus the Secretary of State. On the Chinese side, the head of the Foreign Affairs Office of the Central Committee, currently Yang Jiechi, and possibly the two vice chairs of the Central Military Commission, because in the Chinese system it's bifurcated. The foreign policy establishment answers directly into the president, and the military system answers directly into the president and general secretary of the party. And never the twain shall meet until it's inside Xi Jinping's head. That's the kind of the way their system works. What's the likelihood that such a system that I've outlined could actually prevent crisis, conflict and war between China and the United States? I don't know. But I am confident it could reduce the probability and the risk of it happening. This is not based on trust. It is not based on the virtue in the hearts of either the American or the Chinese administrations. It's based on a very realist analysis of where we're up to now and a deal of realist conclusion about why it is really in each side's interests to, in fact, avoid an entirely avoidable war. Thank you very much for attendance. Ian, let's have a chat.
So nice to be back on stage with you in real life and all of this stuff. Congratulations on the book.
Thanks, mate.
For those of you watching this real time, not in the room, you can buy this book on Amazon.
This is my literary agent.
If you want war with China, you can buy Graham Allison's book. But if you don't want war, this is the book you should buy. So you're capable of doing something about this. So I want to start with a little bit of an unfair question, but I think a very interesting one.
I like your socks.
Thank you. You knew that was going to come. I mean, which is, look, I certainly think of you as the most respected China watcher in the West. I think that's increasingly a common opinion. I'm wondering, after 2 years of not traveling anywhere, including to China, and with the Chinese officials in as much isolation as they've been in, what's the thing you're most concerned that you might be getting wrong right now?
The thing I'm most concerned about getting wrong, because I haven't been to Beijing for 2 years, is the extent to which, right now, the Chinese are accurately or inaccurately reading the European and international reaction to what's unfolding with Russia and Ukraine. Because what I don't know is Xi Jinping being internally shielded from the full dimensions of this reality? That people actually don't accept the notion that a sovereign state can invade and seek to occupy and take over another state, or whether his official class is so mindful of their own career prospects that they're shielding him from the truth of the implications of China's current position of tacit support for Putin's decision to invade and the continued military operation in Ukraine.
And that's a big uncertainty.
Yeah, because I don't know. I can surmise that the system's not giving Xi Jinping the full unvarnished truth. I don't know that. And if we kick around Beijing a bit, Heng Chee's enormously experienced as a former senior Singaporean diplomat. I kick around Beijing and I've got a bunch of friends in the military and elsewhere. If you're there for a few weeks and you have a few drinks, you can get a sense of where things stand. I'm in the dark. So that is the big caveat.
And it is, I guess the reason I started with that is precisely because if you want to avoid sleepwalking towards confrontation, being in the dark is the last place you want to be.
This is why I think President Biden's call with Xi Jinping the other day was a good move, because I think the American internal analysis in Washington, and I was in D.C. both yesterday and last week and had an opportunity for a few conversations with folks, is the underpinning logic of the Jake Sullivan meeting with Yang Jiechi in Rome
last week,
a week ago, 10 days ago, I can't remember. Yeah. It all blurs these days. Yeah. Then the president's call on Friday with the virtual summit with Xi Jinping of 2 hours. Jake's was 7 hours. Is in the latter one in particular, that is the direct Xi on Biden conversation, to enable President Xi to know from the horse's mouth, this is what we're concerned about. This is what we think is happening on the ground, we, the United States.
We will hit you hard.
And third, if you provide financial and military support for Putin at this stage, particularly if it's material, which would actually cause a change in the nature of the battle space, then you will experience, as China, financial retaliation. I think that's a smart call because it's based on the assumption we don't know how much data is coming up in its full, accurate, gory detail to numero uno in the Chinese system.
Now, Biden woke up this morning, and before he got on a plane to head to Europe, he said that there needs to be a new world order, and the United States needs to lead it. How do you think that's going to be responded to in China? How much do you think it matters?
Not entirely positively, I think would be my surmise. I would probably not necessarily have started my day by saying that. If you'd read Dale Carnegie, at least when I was a kid, and Winning Friends and Influencing People, I'm not sure it basically says you can just go jump in the lake. I understand where he's coming from, because if I look at the future of a liberal international order, underpinned with the reality of American geostrategic power versus an hierarchical authoritarian capitalist order led by Xi Jinping's China, I think a lot of people in the world would have a fairly clear idea which way they'd want to go, despite America's multiple faults. Most recent one I can think of is called the Iraq War, but let's not go there. So the Chinese starting point with that will be an intrinsically and instinctively nationalist reaction. You see, the Chinese language they use in the system at the moment, Ian, 4 Chinese words, Dongsheng Xijiang, rise of the East, decline of the West. That is euphemism for rise of China, decline of the United States. Forget everyone else, by the way, that's what it's actually about. It's not even a poetic device. That's actually what it's meant to mean. And so the nationalism which that actually, which underpins that sentiment, is felt not just by Xi himself and the elites around him, but through a very skillful propaganda apparatus around the Chinese system. If you speak to Chinese university lecturers dealing with any Chinese kid under the age of 25 or 30, the nationalism factor out there for younger Chinese about China's time having come is real. So I think, therefore, the reaction to being directly confronted with the we're still going to be in charge of this new world order. In other words, continued American leadership of a newly defined international system. Final point, though, I understand why the president did it, because he's off to...
he's off to this emergency NATO summit.
He's off to Brussels. And you don't go to Brussels for fun, in my experience. You go there for work. Have I offended any Belgians here? I'm sorry about that. But have you ever known there to be a clear day in Brussels? Not in my experience. It's always raining. But the bottom line is this. He knows that Europe ultimately can be softish on these geostrategic questions. Brussels in particular, having their cake and eating it too, not just with the Russians, but particularly with the Chinese. So I think that's the rationale.
So do you think that Xi Jinping, I mean, I know that there are many reasons for it, but of course it was an extraordinary statement that was made on February 4th with Putin by the Chinese president and their friendship without limits, which we certainly should take seriously, if not literally. Do you think that he made a strategic mistake? And perhaps more importantly, how do you place that decision and the events that have followed in terms of the impact of the likelihood of confrontation ultimately between the U.S. and China?
I think the two are quite separable points. I think in the Chinese system there is a strong view that Xi Jinping did make a strategic mistake. If you look at the statement or the joint declaration the 4th of February between Russia and China, which I wrote about a couple of days after that, and you have in your own newsletter, and many others have, and have written far more eloquent pieces than I have on this question, is that my baseline analysis, knowing how the Chinese system thinks about the Russian Federation, is that Xi Jinping was way over ahead of his skis on this question in terms of where the center of gravity of the Chinese political system normally is on Russia. A, they certainly want a strong relationship with Russia. B, they don't want any problems on the Russian-Chinese border. C, they want Russia to give the Americans as much grief as possible because tying down America and the Middle East and Europe is good for business if you're China. And D, we work with Russia and the UN Security Council to give the Americans as much grief in the world as possible. But that's different from what was in the declaration the 4th of February. It was all the above, plus, for the first time, China digging in direct support of the Russian position on Ukraine, that is, no future expansion of NATO. And secondly, to acknowledge in that declaration that Russia had legitimate security interests in Europe which needed to be addressed. That's where he's out ahead of his skis, or let's call it of where the Chinese political system would normally be. So my assessment is that I won't say it's an overstretch to say Xi Jinping is therefore vulnerable in the Chinese system, but he doesn't represent, in my view, the mainstream of the Chinese system, given as I've seen it evolve over the last 20 years on the Russia relationship. So if it turns really badly, and you're the Russia expert here, my friend. By the way, this guy, Ian Bremmer, has lived for a year in Ukraine, did his PhD on...
A long time ago, yeah.
What did you do your PhD on?
On Russians in Ukraine.
On Russians in Ukraine. So he actually knows his stuff. This is a part of the world that I can only, as it were, feel through a glass dimly, as opposed to know it well. Ian knows this part of the world, so hence I defer to you on this. If Putin fails in Ukraine, militarily and politically, and therefore diplomatically, this will not rebound well on Xi Jinping's internal, as it were, political stocks in the lead up to the 20th Party Congress this November.
Do you think, when we talk about managed strategic competition, is that inevitably a kind of new Cold War between the Americans and Chinese? Is that, as a baseline, unavoidable?
I have a feeling we're emerging into something which is, has its own characteristics, which using the simple application of a new Cold War doesn't fully capture. The geopolitics are Cold War-like. Mm-hmm. The geoeconomics are not. Mm-hmm. Because the geoeconomics has us in a system where these two economies, the largest and the second largest in the world, with massive continued enmeshment today in trade and in capital markets and in other domains, has nothing in common at all with the first Cold War, between the United States and the Soviet Union when there was zero economic enmeshment. Now, this creates what I would describe as a problem or a challenge in international relations which is almost sui generis. So the applicator of Cold War 2.0 makes for a great headline, makes for a great piece of, quick haiku summary of the situation. I don't think it's accurate. It's different. I don't have the neat term for it. You and I should have a long drink later this evening and come up with it, but it's not Cold War 2.0. It's different.
Now, how much...
It could get there, but not given the common capital markets between China and the United States as of the end of last year was $5 trillion. That's how big the common capital market engagement between these two financial systems is. That was never the case with the Sovs. And therefore, unraveling that takes a lot of time. The trade relationship would take a lot of time. Imagine the supply chain implications of that unraveling. Take a long time.
And therefore, the Russian pivot towards autarky and we need to do it by ourselves is a lot easier for them. It's much more gravitational than it would be for the Chinese. For China, when you see them talking about common prosperity, which feels like Chinese populism, when you see them talking about more focus on Chinese supply chain, more focus on Chinese consumer, and when you recognize that they feel like the United States at least is trying to contain them with Huawei and all of the other export controls and the rest, how much decoupling do you think the Chinese government themselves, at least under Xi, believe is desirable / inevitable?
Yeah, I think there are two debates here. One's, let's call it the common prosperity debate, which is an internal Marxist debate within the country. And the second is, let's call it decoupling with Chinese characteristics taken on by China itself, as opposed to the common Washingtonian view, hey, we're going to decouple, that's a uniquely American decision, and you just have to wait for us Americans to decide how much we're going to decouple. I'll just come back to that in one second.
But I like that frame. It's a useful frame, yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you. You don't often say that about anything I say.
Well, that's not true.
That's good. We have this Laurel and Hardy routine, which we've been working on for some years. On the first one, though, on common prosperity, Heng Chan, who introduced us kindly before, in our earlier meeting of the ASPI Policy Council, and in response to questions and observations from others, including Yoriko Kawaguchi, the former foreign minister of Japan, talked about the problem of equity is an emerging dynamic in the internal politics of Asia. You sense it in Singapore, and the reflections were you are seeing it elsewhere, including in Japan. And certainly it's an issue within Marxist-Leninist China. And what I have noticed carefully through Xi Jinping's pivot to the left on economic policy settings domestically within China over the last 4 to 5 years now is his rubric of common prosperity is kind of his anchoring principle to bring about a more equal distribution of wealth in China and frankly less obvious forms of privately held wealth from the Chinese private sector capitalist class. So that debate's unfolding, and in my judgment, is one of the reasons why you're seeing slowing economic growth in China, because the private sector is scared about what will happen to them. So that's out there. On this other stuff, decoupling with Chinese characteristics, I think that dates back to about April of 2019. There was a Politburo meeting in Beijing where the comrades got together and looked at the first draft of a solution to the trade war with the Trump administration. And the comrades got together, Liu He had come back from Beijing, and they said, "Nya, don't like it. This is just going too far." Now, Xi Jinping has reported at that meeting, and we don't have this officially, so this is a Kevin theory as opposed to empirical fact, but he's reported as having said to this Politburo meeting, we are now into 30 years of trouble with the Americans. They're going to seek to stop our rise, strangle our access to American technology or international technology, and in order to prevent us from becoming the world's largest economy and the dominant power in the world. And this is now underway. We will now embrace upon a period of growing Chinese national economic self-sufficiency. We will now reframe our economic policy settings, and we will, in our own time, make ourselves much less vulnerable to the United States. That's what I call decoupling with Chinese characteristics. Whether Washington thinks they are decoupling or not, that's what our friends in Beijing, in my judgment, are up to.
And that level of decoupling, would you agree that it makes confrontation more likely, not less likely?
If you think it through, in the logic of what I said before in my resistance to the applicator of Cold War 2.0, if economic decoupling is actually concluded over a space of 3 to 5 years, you are then into a classically Cold War environment. But that is not currently the case. And we have yet to see the manifestation of the policy instruments which Xi Jinping has put in place on this. The problem, by the way, with his policy instruments on national self-sufficiency, guess what? They turbocharge the slowing of Chinese domestic growth, just like his domestic common prosperity agenda is doing, which is about income redistribution for internal, shall we say, Marxist social equity reasons. You then seek to decouple the Chinese economy from the United States, pursue a national self-sufficiency agenda. Guess what that's about? That's about the further intervention by the Chinese state and the party into the normal market-based operations of the Chinese economy through industrial policy, state and enterprise policy and the rest, which further impedes economic growth. And so I think you've got these two sets of headwinds against classically reasonably rapid Chinese economic growth still. And on the other side of the economic policy agenda in Beijing, led by the market reformers and Liu He and the team, the vice premier responsible for the economy, who will probably retire at this 20th Party Congress, then they will be very concerned about where this leads Chinese growth overall. And looking at the geopolitics of that, you may then be in the position where for the first time some of us may begin to analytically question whether China will indeed surpass the United States as the world's largest economy.
And that gets me to a longer-term question, which is, which of the following two would give you greater pause about level of conflict? If China in the next 10 years is incapable of surpassing the United States economically and really faces serious internal economic contradictions and challenges, or if it turns out that just as we were wrong about China not being able to catch up with us technologically in the last 10 years, that actually China proves to be absolutely dominant in core technologies within 10 years and surpasses the United States. Which of those two would be more problematic for avoiding confrontation? And why?
I am more worried about the second scenario than I am about the first. And the reason I am more worried about that is because of the ultimate Marxist-Leninist nature of the political system in Beijing. The intellectual software of the Chinese political system is ultimately an hierarchical one, whereby its conception of an order, an alternative order to the United States, where it is economically and technologically and militarily dominant, even in the absence of war, is one with all roads leading to Beijing. And as our friends in Southeast Asia well know from history, and the rest of East Asia, has a certain pattern to it, which would eventually extend to other parts of the world. Would it be therefore more likely to induce crisis, conflict and war with the United States? I think so, because unless the United States somehow in its political culture could gently translate itself into sublime retirement, which I don't think is politically possible given the Americans that I know, unless they've all been hiding somewhere, then I think that's going to invite a reaction. So therefore, on the former scenario you outlined, which China doesn't get there, which is the growth formula stalls. And there's a big debate in China now about whether that growth formula is stalled. And there is a further debate in China about a more immediate sense of, has the regime fundamentally got it wrong on pandemic management? Because the pandemic has now jumped the border from Hong Kong. The Marxist-Leninist hubris about we authoritarians can control pandemics and you crazy capitalists in the democratic West, you can't. Well, that's got a few narrative problems now within the Chinese system as well. So if the Chinese fell short on the growth question, the pandemic cuts out of control, you have foreign policy embarrassment for Xi Jinping because of Ukraine and an overreach on Putin. My thesis is by the time you get to the 20th Party Congress at the end of this year, you have an interesting set of factors. And for the first time, in my analysis, you would have a contestable outcome in terms of whether Xi Jinping was automatically reappointed as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party for a record third term. Still probable in my view that Xi Jinping will get there, because I've just constructed 3 sets of variables, none of which have yet to be fully materialized.
Does that, the fact that you're more worried and think that it would be much more dangerous if it was that the Chinese became dominant in these technologies, does that nudge you personally towards a more hawkish policy towards China, just in terms of what is most sensible for the West to do?
I've never seen myself in the hawk-dove spectrum, and that may be simply because there are so many variations of a theme within the spectrum. I'm just a deep realist, and the Chinese are deep realists, those of us who have worked with the system. And therefore, my response is along these lines. If the Marxist-Leninist nature of the Chinese Communist Party is such that they think that the United States and the collective West is a giant vibrating bowl of marshmallow, with actually no sense of a political and strategic backbone, then in the tradition of a Marxist-Leninist party, they will march straight through it, not physically, but they will march straight through it in terms of their political and foreign policy and national security resolve, and that'll include Taiwan. And the one thing I find quite interesting from what's unfolding in Ukraine at the moment is this. Against the overall Chinese internal narrative, which has been universal now for about the last 18 months, about the rise of the East and the decline of the West, is the hardening of resolve in Europe, the 180-degree change in German security policy, the statement by Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, from the centre-left and the Bundestag about the future of German defence policy and defence outlays. This does not fit the narrative in Beijing that we are just a collective bunch of postmodernist marshmallow just waiting for people with a firm sense of the future to walk in and tell us what to do. It upsets the narrative. And so for those reasons, I think Xi Jinping went into 2022, Ian, wanting a very quiet year.
Yeah, that's not happening.
Okay. Yeah. And I just got to say, you know, this kind of hasn't gone to plan. And in response to an unquiet year, my judgment is the policy decisions in Beijing have been less than prudent.
Now, I'm going to take a couple questions from the audience. Before I do, I want to follow up on this one and then ask you one to close. The one I want to follow up...
It's pretty forensic, by the way.
What?
It's pretty forensic. You've got notes and everything there.
Well, yeah, but I'm not really paying attention to them. They're just like here to show that like I read the book. Where I wanted to go, you kind of avoided that last question, which is because I wasn't really asking about the whole how do you make sure that the Chinese pay attention and don't walk on us. I was asking something that was kind of a little more interesting to me, which is that if you believe that the Chinese, that the biggest potential threat out there is that, God forbid, given their system, they actually get dominant, then as you're thinking about setting policy, not before the 20th Party Congress, but for the next 10 years, as you're thinking about setting out what we need to do, is it safer to err on the side of let's hit them harder to make sure that doesn't happen? In other words, and I'm not asking you to say this makes me a hardliner on China. I'm asking you if it nudges you analytically in that direction.
Since the rise of Xi Jinping, and particularly since the 19th Party Congress in 2017, my own analysis of China's trajectory has hardened over time in response to the evidence.
Yeah.
And frankly, the response to Xi Jinping within China has caused many within Chinese political and policy elites to have a parallel view. If you like, there's a debate in the China watching community, which is what we're observing in terms of, let's call it Chinese nationalism, the hardening of Chinese assertiveness towards its neighbours and towards other countries in the world. Is that simply a continuum which is an expression of a long-standing set of Chinese domestic, political and economic and foreign policy and ideological settings? Doesn't matter who the leader is. Or is what we're seeing a set of circumstances which is particular to Xi Jinping? The answer, of course, is it's a cocktail. But if I was to draw, and this will not translate well in the written record of this, a trajectory of Chinese national, political and foreign policy and military assertiveness, since, frankly, the beginning of Hu Jintao's second term in 2008, it's kind of been going like this. And then you get to Xi Jinping, and it goes a bit like this, and then to Xi Jinping's second term, and it's gone like that. Yeah. So, wherein lies individual leadership agency as opposed to systemic structure? If we're being political scientists about this, you're the political scientist, I'm not. There is a high degree of change in China's strategic trajectory which has been directed by numero uno, which in the Chinese system has created its own set of quite big political antibodies, both in the military, the foreign policy establishment and politics. Will that end up in the critical mass by the end of this year in Chinese domestic politics to cause a course correction? Can't predict. But let's call it the dynamics are becoming sharper than they were before for the reasons we've discussed.
Okay. So last question I'm going to ask before we go to a couple of questions from the audience. Please raise your hands. I'll call on you. We'll go up here. It's an easier one. It is, I liked in the...
You'd be unusually tough on me.
I know. But I liked in the introduction the fact that you started off with similarities between the United States and China. And you said the love of family, the importance that both Chinese and Americans attach to the education of their children, and their vibrant entrepreneurial cultures driven by aspiration and hard work. Do you think, as you look ahead over the coming 10, 20 years, are those things likely to persist in the same way in the United States and China? What are the things that concern you about the connective tissue that actually does create some level of understanding between these two great countries?
You see, I've lived in both these cultures for quite a number of years. I've lived in China for a total of about 3 years, in one capacity or another. I've lived now in this great country for 5 of the last 7 years. I'd never lived in the United States before, by the way. This is kind of new for me. So understanding the American barbarians has been a tricky thing as well, apart from the Chinese. And, of course, we Australians are barbarians by definition. But you know something? If you try and detach yourself from culture, which none of us can do. Look at me. I'm a creature of the West, okay? Criminal background, Australian, the whole thing. British jail, 18th
His brother
century.
was almost killed by a kangaroo.
That's true. Well,
Actual story.
It's a true story.
Yeah.
For all those reasons, if you live in a culture for a while, you really get to feel it, sense it, experience it, breathe it, live it. And having done that in China, having lived in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, a longer period of time in Beijing, you actually have this deep respect for this extraordinary culture and civilization and its extraordinary achievements, its aesthetic tradition, the love of family, the centrality of this sort of Confucian ethic of education and hard work and achievement. It's palpable. And when you see it then combust in the world of commerce and Chinese enterprises from Alibaba to the rest just out there, creating enormous value added to the world, you think, this is just wonderful. And you see the same thing here when I see firms, many of whom are represented by folks in this room. Family businesses become global businesses. This is quite extraordinary. And so the entrepreneurial culture, the education culture, I want my kids to succeed, and the respect for the world of ideas, actually, among its elites, is again palpable. But you know something, in the ultimate anchorings of political systems, either in a Marxist-Leninist worldview, which is what is the ongoing reality of the Chinese political system, whether we like it or not, that's just the reality, and a notion of limited government anchored in the rights of the individual. Ultimately, these two worldviews find themselves in conflict. If we can navigate our way through that, then my sense of the mood of the peoples and frankly the business communities of both countries is that they would have this resolve. We really love American popular culture. We really want to make a whole bunch of money, and we'd love to do that together and do some creative stuff if we could fix the politics. And therein, my friend, lies the question.
That is the problem. That is the problem. So before we close, let's take two really good, sharp questions. I see one right there. If you don't mind coming up to the microphone, and you too, sir, you come up right behind them. Those are the two we're going to get. And let's talk loud so we make sure we get it on the live stream. Please, sir.
Okay, thanks. The question is, this is a very important topic, and I thought one interesting thing is about the Chinese perspective, right? How China looks at this. And one of the things from the West, we look at China, and one of the mistakes or maybe shortcomings is that we think China is a monolithic bloc, right? And it's not, right? If you look at I'm glad you point out the last 5 years, the recent 5 years of Xi Jinping's rule, quite different from first period, quite different from previous period. And there is a tremendous struggle. If you look at it from Chinese perspective, there's a tremendous struggle between essentially two paths of going forward for China, right? Even internally. We're not talking about anything to do with the United States or anything else. Internally, there's a huge struggle, not a debate, huge political struggle, political survival on these two paths. Essentially, and you look at it from Chinese official media, you could have a bipolar kind of person. One day, there's an article that says, we want to honor Deng Xiaoping, and economic development is the focus, open and reform is the policy. And then the next day, you have, once again, in the official Chinese media saying, oh, we remember the days of Chairman Mao, let's go back to that socialist roots of common prosperity, right? So we mentioned common, and the question to you, Kevin, is how do you look at that struggle? I think that struggle is probably going to determine this outcome, because if the open and reform section wins out, and you pointed out correctly, and I share the same view, that it's a contestable outcome of the 20th Party Congress. Previously, last year was not thinkable, but now it's possible. But the point is that if the reform section wins out in this struggle, not a debate, it's a struggle, then this question is easier to answer, as opposed to the going back to the Mao system section wins out.
I've got it.
Right.
Let me try and answer very briefly, because we're short for time. I'm glad you used the word struggle, because in Chinese Communist Party, the word dozheng is not a debate. Struggle can in the Chinese system be either violent or non-violent. And also it's a term which in the Chinese political vernacular can refer to how you conduct both internal politics and external politics. But let's just stick to the internal. And I think you are right in the sense that as we look at the Chinese official media, we are surprised here in the Asia Society, in the analytical world, about the emergence of, I won't say a two-line struggle, that overstates it, but that was certainly the nomenclature used in the period of the Cultural Revolution, 66, 76. but certainly two tendencies as far as the future of politics and the political economy is concerned, and a view of the world. Is it a Deng view? Is it a Mao view? But basically it's a reform view versus a conservative view. And it's all about the centrality or the non-centrality of the party and everything. Xi Jinping's maxim is north, south, east, west, doesn't matter whether it's the party, whether it's the military, whether it's the academy, whether it's people's lives, the party is central to all. That's an old Maoist phrase rehabilitated by Chee most recently. And when those of us in the analytical community looked at that one recently, we said, that's interesting. And then you have literature emerging most recently from senior academics and from senior researchers saying Deng in the period of openness was in fact critical to China's current economic success. Why are we trashing that? And furthermore, on the foreign policy side, why on earth are we backing Putin in Ukraine when that's inconsistent with the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence introduced by Zhou Enlai in 1954, of which mutual non-interference is core and central. So you're right, this will be determined internally. The one word of wisdom for our American friends and the rest of the international community in all of this is never conflate China as a national entity with its current politics right now. Never conflate the Chinese people with the politics of right now. Don't even conflate the Chinese Communist Party with the politics of the moment. This is a debate within the Chinese current political leadership. And adding fuel to the fire of that debate by causing that internal debate within China to conclude that the rest of the world is anti-China right now does not help in producing an optimal outcome internally.
Last question is to you, sir.
Mr. Bremmer, Prime Minister Rudd, thank you. My name's John. I'm a former Schwartzman Scholar, I guess, still. I'm also an advisor to General McMaster at the Hoover Institution. I work with him. I wanted to... to him. Will do. Thank you. Prime Minister Rudd, you made 2 observations that I'd like to balance against each other in a question. One observation was that U.S. China strategic competition indeed includes a battle for ideas. And another observation was that it might be best for avoiding conflict to let the best system win and perhaps take a point of moral neutrality. Please correct me if I'm wrong if I did not understand that correctly. I'd like to, if I may, just ask how those 2 things balance against each other in the context of what we've recently seen in Ukraine, with 3 observations. One, that Ukraine's relative superiority in the information domain has advantaged them on the strategic level of war. And we've seen that contrasted between Hua Chunying parroting language about American chemical weapons programs and European capitals really moving faster than they ever could have anticipated to counter Russia, thanks to Zelensky, thanks to what we've seen of the Russian depredation in Ukraine. So for the United States to compete effectively, for the United States to have strategic competence, as General McMaster likes to speak of, to what degree should human rights dialogue in the information domain be played into? Or does that do more harm than good, and instead of giving strategic competence, actually increase the risk for war? I hope you understand, and in terms of balancing those 2 things, because it's something I haven't been able to figure out, and I'm wondering what you think.
No, thank you very much for the question, and it's a central question. Take a seat, mate.
Thanks.
Maybe have a rest. The point 1, when I outlined before what I described as a possible joint strategic framework for this relationship, that is one which can be assented to in Beijing and in Washington to manage strategic competition in a manner which doesn't result in us blowing each other's brains out by accident, crisis, conflict, and war. To do that, it has to be a framework which accepts that there will be a contest of ideas between the Chinese authoritarian capitalist model reflected in Xi Jinping's concept of a community of common destiny for all humankind, etc., and its own intrinsic hierarchical worldview, versus our collective, just say, democratic worldview, which is about the centrality of individual freedom and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, drafted in large part by Eleanor Roosevelt. That's the contest. That's the battle of ideas. But both sides actually have to accept that it is a contest. I will not even leave you in any doubt as to which side of that contest I happen to be on, or that the contest should be had. Because I think the peoples of the world, notwithstanding the fact the developing world have massive problems of economic opportunity and development and poverty, to which the Chinese frame of reference is speaking, as you know well as a scholar, has some cogency in that constituency. If you are poor and have no opportunity in the Central African Republic, guess what? You're going to be more persuaded that I actually want food on the table rather than my right to vote in an election. That's kind of the constituency argument which the Chinese are putting. I have a view that as social democracies in particular, that you can do both. You can assist in the development agenda of the developing world, not just pretend that doesn't exist, but at the same time be fully supportive of the intrinsic principles of human dignity and human freedom. So in my argument, if it's to be a joint strategic framework, you've actually got to say, let the contest begin, let it unfold. I have a high degree of confidence as to whose side of the argument would prevail in that contest across the world if properly executed. If you bring back Donald Trump, I'm much less optimistic, by the way, but that's just a personal view on my side of the equation. But this cannot be quarantined out of the global strategic competition now underway between China and the United States. I'm just saying the framework has to be mutually acceptable in order for it to begin. And if it's put in those terms, I think there's a bunch of people in China who would have a few worries about the open contest of the ideas, the battle for ideas that would then ensue.
I think what's revolutionary about this argument of yours and what will be the hardest for Americans to accept is that the United States, I mean, when we talk about managed competition, the Chinese say, yeah, your view of competition is we're gonna play a tennis match, but first the Americans are gonna break our racket. And that doesn't make for much of a... And you're basically saying, no, in order to have this work, the competition actually has to be mutually agreed upon and fair. And that is a radically different orientation than the one that unilateralist Americans have historically, and exceptionalist Americans have historically been willing to accept. And maybe it takes an Australian to come in and tell the Americans that that's the way it has to be. But I do think that not only for Trump, even for Biden, this would be a radical, true, not just saying you accept it, but truly accepting it would be a radical departure from most things the Americans have done in reality post-1945.
Except you had a form of managed strategic competition with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and the ideas of freedom and containment prevailed in that period. I'm arguing for a different form of managed strategic competition, given the different realities we currently face. On the unilateral argument, that is, if I was sitting in the Oval Office now providing advice to the United States President about how to prevail against China within managed strategic competition, I would have a different set of advices. I would probably not be invited into Zhongnanhai to do the same with President Xi Jinping. And I would be unlikely to probably accept that invitation. But I'm saying in the business of strategic stability and not blowing each other's brains out on the way through, there is something in this concept. It's not ultimately from outer space. You've done something similar during the last Cold War with the Soviets. And guess what? We're all still alive as a result. Let's use a bit of creative imagination, again around the prospect of a joint strategic framework. And when I say, may the best system win, I have a fair bit of confidence as to which system would prevail under those circumstances. He's got one further point he wants to say.
If I may, do you think it's then worth going after the Chinese on those differences?
Question, is it worth going after the Chinese on those differences?
On Xinjiang, on Hong Kong?
On Xinjiang, on Hong Kong.
Absolutely. I mean, because...
That's too risky.
No. Even in the Australian debate on national China policy, I say there are 5 principles, one of which is Principle number one, be very clear with our Chinese friends where we stand on universal human rights and articulate that in terms of what that means vis-a-vis Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong and Taiwan in particular. It's part of the debate. It can't just be pushed to one side.
With an understanding that increasingly the Chinese will have lots of things to say about the American political system, its failings, and all the rest.
Yeah, which they do.
Yeah.
The idea that this is somehow some one-way debate that China is engaged in, that the United States is engaged in, critical of Chinese human rights practices, my God, you should see what's in the Chinese media about what's going on in this country. Right now, if you were living in Beijing and completely quarantined from information from the rest of the world, you'd be convinced that all of you are dying of COVID, that everyone is being murdered in the streets of New York as we speak, and that who would ever come to this country in the future.
And that the Russians were winning in Ukraine.
And the Russians are winning in Ukraine.
You would also believe that. Yes,
so the bottom line is, I never buy the Chinese argument that, oh, you've hurt the feelings of 1.4 billion people because you've said something nasty about Tibet. And I've done this before as Prime Minister of Australia, in Chinese, in speeches in Beijing University. And I was again hurting the feelings of 1.4 billion people. Every day of the week in the People's Daily, it's an excoriation of inequality and racial discrimination in this country and in the rest of the collective West. So let's not pretend that this is a one-way street. All I'm saying is, let's have some rules for the road. Let's have some guardrails so it doesn't spin off into crisis, conflict and war on the way through. And may we end up, if we can navigate what I call the decade of living dangerously here, which is the decade ahead, when we start to draw closer in terms of Xi Jinping's mental timetable on Taiwan, if we manage to get through that, we may actually be able to land in a better place whereby the political elites in both countries can think their way through to problem solving in a different way. I'm more worried about the immediate decade ahead and getting through it alive for all of us.
It's a good message after the last 4 weeks. The book is The Avoidable War. Comes with a pair of socks. You should buy it on Amazon.
These socks.
Everybody thank Kevin for a wonderful evening.